Dr. Zelikowsky, we hear that you study the mechanics of emotion.
I do. Yeah. I study how the brain encodes emotional information and processes that to generate emotional behavior.
All kinds of emotions or a specific kind?
We mostly focus on fear and emotion states produced by various forms of stressors, such as acute trauma or prolonged social isolation.
So is this the process of studying this involves looking at how cells behave, or it involves looking at the things that are outside of cells, or it's the structures of the brain? What are the mechanics of these sorts of states?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways one could look at emotion states in the brain. And when you do so, oftentimes you have a correlation with that state and given a given behavior. So we do actually spend quite a lot of time looking at kind of emotion specific behaviors and how those may or may not be altered by different regions of the brain, circuits in the brain, molecules in the brain, synapses. So there's a huge variety in terms of what you can look at for the mechanics or neural circuitry that underlies emotion states. So we in particular do a lot of what's called systems neuroscience. So we'll look at how circuits that include many, many regions in the brain operate to encode and control emotion states. We might look at one region, and that's kind of considered a emotion hub. And that's pretty typical for the field, finding specific hub regions and the emotion states that they may or may not encode. And then more recently, we've been really interested in neuropeptides and how those are important for encoding emotion states in the brain.
Is this an unusual way of pursuing this sort of research? Like, what's the history of this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the history is definitely not new. People have been looking at neurotransmitters, so other signaling molecules, for years and years. And if you've been to any kind of psychiatrist ever, or know someone who has, most people are on drugs for things like depression and anxiety, which really target a lot of these neurotransmitter systems. So kind of a popular one is the serotonin system. And so you can take a lot of different forms of SSRIs or serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And those are, really important for mitigating the effects of depression. So the idea of looking at kind of neurochemicals in the brain and as they circulate and targeting those to, get at or try and reduce some of the negative effects that come with some emotion states like you have maybe with depression is definitely not novel.
But have humans been designing drugs to treat these emotional mishaps for a long time, or is that a relatively new idea?
I think at least probably, I'm not a psychiatrist or a pharmacist, so I don't know the exact years, but I think it's, safe to say it's been at least like 50 years, probably longer.
Do you think that was something that humans have always done? Like, have humans always been medicating themselves?
You know what? It's actually a really interesting conversation. I got into it with my mom because we had a conversation where I said, I think, we're getting to a stage where you're either doing regular exercise or you're on an antidepressant. And she was like, "Oh, really? Does everyone need to be on antidepressants?" And we got into this conversation, which is that humans didn't evolve to spend hours and hours in front of computers, in front of TVs, right? We evolved as a species to interact with other members of our species, to spend a lot of time outside, hunting and gathering, to spend a lot of time, kind of doing manual labor, moving our bodies, and less time sitting sedentary. So the idea that we can just all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but in, the last 50 years or so, and definitely much more recently, the idea that we can sit on our iPhones or on our computers or in front of a TV pretty much all day and expect our brains to handle that the same way that they have in the past, I think doesn't really make sense. So I do think that's, why you do see this increase in people taking medications to treat basically, chemical reactions in your brain that may not have adapted for the current lifestyle that we're all living. And I think that's totally fine. And people use other approaches like exercise on a regular basis as kind of forms of treatment for mental illness. And I think those have been pretty effective. And I'm sure we've been doing those kinds of things, whether knowingly or not, for many, many years.
Well, so this ties into something that relates to your work pretty deeply, I think, which is that there is good stress, bad stress, optimal stress.
Yes.
And so underuse would be bad stress due to a lack of exercise, a lack of movement, a lack of social engagement. Crowding or too many social encounters or too much stress is also on the sort of the bad end, right? Because it's a bell-shaped curve where there's an optimal point of what you're experiencing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I find that really interesting. People have been looking at stress, kind of psychogenic stress, that way for a long time. In part, it's very easy to see in cases of like physical stress. So you have, let's say you're about to go give a talk or presentation somewhere. A little bit of stress is great because it kind of amps you up, gets you prepared, makes you kind of think on your toes. But too much stress is really, really detrimental. You kind of might freeze on stage or just not really be operational, kind of helpless is the term that a lot of times psychologists use. And then no stress at all is, also a little bit kind of unusual and may make it less likely that you can kind of have that extra zing you need to operate well in those situations. And obviously that's much more extreme in kind of fight or flight situations, where if you weren't stressed at all and you were just hanging out and some predator was approaching you, probably wouldn't fare well in that kind of situation. So stress is super important and definitely follows that bell-shaped curve. But I think now more recently, people are starting to think of other forms of stress. And like I said, we work on social isolation and how those forms of stress are also potentially falling along this bell-shaped curve, where, if you have absolutely zero social interaction, just nothing at all, it's highly detrimental to your mental health. And then if you have too much, like in the case of overcrowding, can also be detrimental. So there's kind of a sweet spot in between. And exactly how much that is unclear, but even just having one, friend or conspecific can mitigate against a lot of the effects of being completely isolated or alone.
And do you think this is something that humans will adapt to, or will they always need to sort of bioengineer their way out of these conundrums?
That's a good question.
You mean adapt to in terms of, will they just adapt to like kind of this new lifestyles where you're spending less time interacting with others?
Screen world. Yeah.
Well, if the hypothesis is that humans didn't used to be so depressed because they were exercising and doing all these physical activities, do you think they'll adapt to it neuropsychologically?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the time scale of that would probably be well beyond anything we would ever experience. And I don't know that as humans, we would even allow that experiment to happen in the world, because that would require, I think, people feeling pretty bad and unstable, or the species as a whole feeling that way for a while until, biology caught up. If it even could. I'm not sure. That's a super interesting question, though.
Do you know these, these Russian fox studies? Quinn, do you remember the name of those?
No.
There was like these experiments that were done in Russia, I think in the mid 20th century, where they were able to sort of change the entire phenotype of these foxes into domesticated dogs over the course of like 10 generations. Like, it was very surprising to them that evolution unfolded so quickly. Like, the voices of the animals changed, their eye colors, their spots, and they were just selecting based on whether they were friendly.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes sense. 10 generations. A lot of times we select for certain traits, even in lab mice that we might use for experiments, and you can do it in even less time than that. Right. But, with humans, the time course is so long. So yes, maybe in 10 generations, there are some qualities that could be selected in or out. But you'd have to talk to an evolutionary biologist to get the answer to that.
But that's like 500 years almost at the human generation time, right?
I just think that, even one generation isn't going to really tolerate feeling terrible, or not happy or, things like that. So I think using intervening approaches would, I think, block a lot of that evolution from even happening. Because it's like, if you're going to, you look at SSRIs as my example that I've been using, when, you're going to block reuptake of serotonin. So you're not going to be necessarily kind of coming to heads with the fact that you might have issues in your serotonin processing and mechanisms in your brain. So,
well, there's a lot of work that seems to suggest that SSRIs are similar to placebo in effectiveness, which seems to imply that the process of getting treated is actually what's helping people.
Yeah, I think there's definitely truth to that. And I don't, I'm not like a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist. So I don't really work with SSRIs or anything like that. I don't even really work on serotonin. So, but I think there's always a huge placebo effect. I think, the reason why there's still so much research on mental health and emotion states in general, and stress and fear, anxiety, and things like that is because even the medications we do have are not effective much of the time, or they have a lot of unwanted side effects. And that kind of partially ties into this idea that these are huge neurotransmitter systems and they're, operating all over the brain and our bodies and stuff. And so you're taking drugs that kind of affect how this system might work in many different places. Some of which are regions of the brain, for instance, that have completely opposing functions. So it's no surprise that, they're not kind of the like end all cure all, be all end all, just because that would be extremely, I think that would be very unlikely given their role and flexible role in different parts of the brain and mediating many, many different things. So I think, for a long time now, we were like trying to move away from those kinds of approaches, come up with more targeted approaches. And this is the general theme in neuroscience and also, basically in many fields, especially like cancer biology, for instance. So, people aren't going to just irradiate your entire body if you have localized cancer somewhere. So now the kind of push is more and more like focalized approaches where you're identifying certain cell types, certain genetic markers, certain brain regions, and more and more and more, so that you can kind of be able to specifically manipulate certain populations of cells or regions or neurochemicals to target some of these emotion states if you're interested in treating mental illness or other kinds of things.
We talked to Nir Barzilai at Albert Einstein in your country, and he works on very similar targeted therapies, but he's trying to stop aging. And it's interesting because he's also a clinical practitioner, and he too mentioned that exercise would accomplish a lot of what he's trying to do in the laboratory, but that something like
I think 3%,
3% of his patients would follow through on the prescriptions of exercise that he gave them. What's up with that?
I'm not going to make a political comment right now.
You're like, that's dangerous. That's the nice.
Current vaccination situation as a indication of that. But I mean, it's hard. It's a time commitment. People would rather take the easy way out. I mean, you just see that over and over again. And I can't even judge that because I'm sure I do that to some degree as well in some form or aspect of my life. So,
well, I just wonder to what extent people even believe it. Like they hear the doctor say, you should exercise, and they don't really understand that those effects actually could accomplish what the pills are accomplishing as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've always just kind of been like of the mind that people believe it, but it's just like too much work or effort or time that a lot of people honestly just don't have, especially if you're, working a lot, either one or two jobs and juggling kids and this and that. The time is hard to find, but it might be that without that experience, people might not even necessarily believe it or really understand, the equivalency of those kinds of effects. And then oftentimes you see that when people do experience it and see those benefits, they are the ones that usually stick to those plans.
And they become the proselytizers.
Yeah.
They start the fitness YouTube channels.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that it might not even be really plausible because people's work doesn't allow them to spend the same kind of time that humans have traditionally spent using their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to think that maybe these, what we're calling drugs right now, could end up being nutrients in a sense because they would actually be necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you mean that's how they would be termed, or
they could functionally act that way in the future. I mean, if people really needed them, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's something to that for sure. And I think, that is one way that people think about it.
So I guess my question is this. You said that you don't study serotonin, you study a different chemical, tachykinin.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. We've been working a lot on tachykinin 2, or I think tachykinin 3 in humans.
And tachykinin is similar to serotonin in that it is a neurotransmitter that's released between cells and is absorbed or received by other cells, and then that causes behavioral changes in those cells, which magnify into behaviors of the organism.
Yes, great. It's a neuropeptide, but so within that family, but
so it's a protein.
Yeah, you nailed it.
It's a protein rather than a chemical compound.
Yes, I mean, it's still a chemical compound.
Sorry.
It's okay. But yeah, I mean, it like a neurotransmitter, it modulates neurons, and it's just a neuropeptide. So, usually those are smaller classes and don't really not oftentimes, but they do get expressed in kind of sometimes more restricted parts of the brain.
Mm-hmm. But you found that it's not necessarily localized to a specific place in the brain.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So that's kind of one of the most exciting things that we discovered when we were looking at the role of tachykinin 2 in encoding the state of social isolation that happens when you're kind of isolated for a prolonged, extended period of time. We really found that this neuropeptide, tachykinin 2, was kind of exerting its function and action in different parts of the brain to control the different effects of isolation. And I think what's really interesting about that is, as I said, a lot of people kind of focus on this hub and spoke type of model of brain states. And I definitely am one of those people as well. So I don't want to, bash it. But what it kind of does is lock you into this way of thinking where there's one brain region X and, it's the hub of fear, it's the hub of anxiety. And then you kind of, can explain the different effects of a state of fear on multiple behaviors through, for instance, projections from that hub, so spokes that go out to different regions. And that's actually, it's been a really useful model in many ways. It's allowed us to identify kind of key brain regions that regulate different emotion states. But it is somewhat limited because you end up in this kind of hub and spoke type of mechanism. And what's really interesting about what we found is...
And sorry, hold on. Let me interrupt you for a second. Hub and spoke means that there is a centralized region of the brain that is responding to this compound or is releasing this compound, and then the effects stretch throughout the brain.
Right. Or it could be many compounds. So like a classic example I'll give is the amygdala. Mm-hmm. So kind of the amygdala is thought to be the brain region that encodes a state of fear. And, you see that in human studies, animal studies, all over. And it's kind of like the fear region, central motive system in the brain. And so the amygdala is connected to many regions. It gets inputs from all sorts of brain regions and then projects out to many other brain regions to control the effects of fear to, for instance, make a deer freeze in headlights and, make a human run from a predator. So many different behaviors that happen when you're in a state of fear would be thought to be kind of controlled by this central hub located in the amygdala.
And this is sort of a holdover of structure-function relationships in biology in general, like the kidney filters the blood. So there should be brain structures that do this, that, or the other thing.
The brain structure that filters fear, obviously.
Obviously.
That's a good way of looking at it. And honestly, it is extremely useful. And you have some of these very powerful, early studies where, for instance, you lesion the amygdala, or you have patients who have calcified amygdalas. And you see all these kind of a host of deficits and fear-related behaviors. And so it's seems pretty convincing that this region would be the hub because, you take it away and all of a sudden you have a person with no fear, an animal with no fear.
But there's some nuance emerging to that now. The paradigm shifting a little.
There is more nuance. There's like lots of studies where you kind of, do what's called like overtraining. And you see this in other systems as well, memory systems and things like that, where it's like regions that seem to be chief or central for that process, like encoding a memory or generating, fear response. With a lot of overtraining, you can sometimes overcome it just because there's a lot more plasticity in the brain than I think we had thought originally. But, you still see some long lasting deficits. So I definitely don't want to abandon this idea that there are central hubs for, certain emotions or variants of them. I just think that there are some cases where certain emotion states, for instance, that produced by prolonged social isolation, could be encoded in a different way. And people also think about this when they're thinking about TBI, traumatic brain injury, where, something happens and the brain shakes inside the skull. You're either, in like a war situation, or you fall in, or get hit in the head in football or something. And it's not like something specific happened to some part of your brain. The whole brain shakes in your skull. And so that kind of generates this diffuse effect on your entire brain. And so, things like that, things like prolonged forms of stress, which may not even be very dramatic, but occur across a long period of time. I think you can think about as being encoded, not necessarily in a hub, but instead using this kind of neurochemical substrate. So as I was mentioning, TAC2 is one such example where TAC2 expression and TAC2 functioning in different parts of the brain control the effects of isolation to alter many different behaviors. So, if you've been isolated for a long period of time, many, many things change in a negative way. This has been documented basically across every single species. One of hallmark thing is animals become much more violent. And so that's kind of one thing you see, but you also see this increase in anxiety and depression and things like that. And so what we found is this really involves TAC2 signaling in different parts of the brain. And some of these regions aren't even connected. So you can't really reduce it down to hub and spoke type of mechanism because, the TAC2 signaling in one area occurs in, for instance, one part of the brain that doesn't project far out to other regions, but kind of exerts a local effect. And that it controls aggression, and a different part of the brain has TAC2 signaling that controls fear, anxiety, and other things. So I think it's just this really interesting example of how you might have a neuropeptide system kind of exert function over the entire brain to encode a state in a kind of like web-like chemical fashion. I think that's an interesting way of looking at emotion states that is starting to extend beyond how we've been looking at it in the past.
To come back to Micky's question about these sorts of things as nutrients, is there a single direction of tachykinin that, if you take something that can get across the the blood-brain barrier, could you just fix the problem? Do you know what I mean? Like if you started eating tons and tons of tachykinin, would you fix your problem?
Well, yeah. I mean, what you'd want to do is lower it.
Oh, okay. So like something that breaks tachykinin down then.
Yeah. And there are actually drugs that have been approved for other reasons that antagonize the receptors that are specific for tachykinin too. And, same thing for other neuropeptides. And those are ones you could take systemically, and they have very similar effects to targeting different regions within the brain or targeting the system within the brain. So that's definitely there. So the potential for, any therapeutic clinical application is definitely there.
It's really interesting to me how this network model is permeating a lot of aspects of knowledge on Earth right now. And I wonder to what degree it reflects your own experience as a transitioning global society.
This is such a huge question. I love it.
Yeah. So like if, these neurochemical webs are, mimic the webs in the whole world.
Well, there's an awareness thing that changes, right? So you go back through the past and the brain is first a machine, then the brain is a computer. Then in the age of the internet, you have neural networks in machine learning and all these artificial brains. But when you look at them, they're not really artificial brains. So it's just a way of speaking about these ideas.
Yeah.
And so as connectivity increases and everyone starts to realize the interconnectedness of things, is there a consequential shift in the way that models are created in the field? Is that what you mean, Micky?
I'm just sort of throwing it out there. It just strikes me as kind of interesting.
I think that's a good question. And it's somewhat philosophical because I think, the brain has pretty much been functioning how the brain functions for a long time. Of course, lots of things in our environment and stuff has changed. But we, the people trying to understand the brain,
right,
have changed a lot. And so approaches change, and that lets people think about the brain in new ways. And so I think it's not surprising that, people start thinking about the universe, and people start thinking about, computers and neural nets. And then all of a sudden they start looking at the brain and seeing the same thing happening there.
Right. I actually saw a headline the other day on Earth that was something like, there's these big filaments linking all the galaxies together that the astronomers are starting to recognize. It just sort of makes me, it's really interesting because I think there's this myth that persists on a lot of planets, which is that science is sort of like this final word, but it's really more of a story in progress that's constantly adapting to new ways of looking at the world. And I think that's really beautiful about it. And
I totally agree.
Sort of misunderstood.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, you can do a little thought experiment by yourself where you think about, how you thought about things when you're young. And then as you age on and on, all of a sudden you feel like you're making these revelations on, every year, a few years, and all of a sudden things seem more connected than they did before. And I think you're just, learning to look at things in a certain way. And then you just start looking at many things in that way. And you kind of keep enhancing the way in which you look at things.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done any experiments to see, okay, so when you're socially isolated, you have increased levels of tachykinin that's produced in the brain, and this translates to negative affective states. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
What if people aren't socially isolated completely? What if they're able to access, let's say, chat programs where they talk to people, or virtual reality, or any number of these weird technologies that are sort of quasi-social but not fully social? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, extremely timely right now. And definitely not the first time I've been asked that, because everyone kind of wants to know, like, well, how good is Zoom going to be at making me still okay and things like that. And so those are the experiments we're actively kind of pursuing in the lab. When you're using a kind of model system, it's a little bit more difficult because you can't really ask the animals, what do you think, or how do you feel having, watched that screen of another animal. So you can do some stuff. You can do kind of like daily exposure, which would be pretty similar to, let's say, living by yourself, during COVID, but going out and, going to the grocery store, seeing one friend or something like that. So you can do those kinds of experiments. And that's something we're still working on, where it looks like, having even some small amount of interaction does help mitigate against the effects produced by chronic social isolation.
Are you making little Zoom calls with the mice?
Well, they're not Zoom calls. So that brings me to my second point. So they're actual physical interactions.
Yeah, I'm curious about the digital interactions.
Right. So, one thing we do see is if you have animals who can see each other still in real life, smell each other and hear each other, but are separated by a perforated divider, it's almost as bad as being isolated.
Whoa.
Yes. So there's at least, in rodent models, the physical interaction is key. I mean, there's just no way to get around it.
So does that mean you're headed down the path of companion robots?
I don't know. That's a good one. I'm sure if I had one of you furry guys, with me in the house, no one would be feeling really isolated.
Aw, thank you.
No one would get any sleep, though.
No, that's true. Talk all the time. So I guess that highlights the difficulty of really studying these sorts of things, because you work in model organisms, mice or rats, and they're not necessarily always comparable to humans.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to hear
Right.
more
I
about
mean,
that
but
model
people
in
are
general.
doing.
Were you able to abrogate those effects, those isolation effects, by modulating that system somehow?
Yeah. So, well, I guess first thing I was going to say is people are doing these kinds of experiments, like cognitive psychologists do these experiments about social isolation and kind of this, the age of social media and all that, and how it's affecting our brains and our social behavior. So I think there are people trying to do those kinds of experiments in humans. And then in terms of, you were saying how much of what we do actually can translate to humans potentially.
Yeah, there's kind of two questions in there. So I guess the first question is, when you have the animals and they're separated by a perforated barrier, can you do something to make it so it's less damaging?
Oh, yes. So if you block these, in our case, these tachykinin receptors across that window of isolation, you can protect animals from developing this kind of effects of prolonged social isolation. So you can protect them. The problem is, and this is true for many different areas of research, is, we are obviously interested in prevention. We're interested in understanding just in general how these states are encoded in the brain. But what people really want to know is what happens if I've already kind of run the tape out. How do I get it? How do I reel it back in? If the toothpaste is out of the tube, how do I get it back in? Or how do I fix something that kind of already broke?
Right.
That sounds like a much harder question.
Those are much hard, and they're much harder experiments to do and kind of things to get. Once you start understanding the circuitry that encodes like a brain state, it's kind of easy to, early on kind of protect from the development of that. It's much harder to kind of like reverse those effects or generate new experiences or memories to kind of counteract that original one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so then the second question is, does this work translate clearly to humans? Because a lot of mouse studies don't, right?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So in terms of the actual social isolation, there's a big kind of correlation between what you see in model systems, like even fruit flies and mice, all the way up to humans, which is, these extended periods of social isolation make us more anxious, more depressed, much more violent, and they're more likely to lead to increases in mortality and things like that. So, the kind of behavioral model is pretty good, which I would say is true for many other models as well. And then in terms of certain systems to target, that's just a question of whether those systems, like for instance, tachykinin 2, are present in the same way in the human brain. And there is some studies suggesting that they are, but whether they function the same way is kind of still unclear. So that's, usually when people try and do some experiments in humans and also try and, potentially do some clinical trials and things like that.
Okay.
This thing, I just want to get your take on this. I don't know if you'll have the answers, but there's these individuals that don't experience pain in the humans, and it usually doesn't work out for them, from what I understand.
Mm-hmm.
They go around and burn themselves on stoves and things like this, and I don't think their lifespan is that long. I wonder if there's any danger of blocking these negative responses in the population at large.
Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it brings up this idea that most of these emotion states kind of developed for adaptive purposes, right? It's good to be afraid. It's good to feel pain. It's good to protect your territory and be able to show aggressive behavior. So all of these things are actually very, very good. They're part of being, an animal. They're part of being human for sure. And in their normal quantities, they're very adaptive and they're very flexible. So you can, exude fear in the appropriate situations and the appropriate amounts and things like that.
So you see it as like a threshold thing, like you said, in its normal quantities.
Yes, exactly. So it's like these systems are normally adaptive, and the real issue is what happens when they are kind of, emitted in situations where they shouldn't be, or to excess, like you have in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And so that's when things, when this normal machinery in your brain goes awry, that's when things become not positive. So it's not that these things are negative in and of themselves. They're highly adaptive and basically make up who we are. But when they're not when the systems and circuits that underlie these states kind of go awry, that's when you start seeing some maladaptive effects on behavior. And so, it would be very important to only kind of target those type of alterations rather than the kind of natural adaptive amount of fear or stress. So,
but when you're talking about whole populations being subject to these unforgiving conditions, it's like, because we were playing with the idea of these drugs becoming nutrient-like in some sense. I don't know. There's no real answer here. It's just a really fascinating line between negative signal to save you and negative signal that's just a headache.
Yeah.
And especially right now on Earth, right? So you've gone through at least a year of isolation in most places, which makes your research particularly relevant because all of a sudden people are returning from a year of isolation and it's a toothpaste back in the tube sort of situation. Because the effects are done. And the same thing with something like PTSD, right? Because by the time that someone has PTSD, the squeeze has happened, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so what happens when you have an entire population that is suffering the effects of PTSD or social isolation, and you don't have just a few people that are dysregulated? You have an entire country.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're in uncharted waters here is my answer to that. I don't think we know how it's going to look. And, these, what I'd call this case of kind of mass social isolation or mass trauma, I think has never really been seen before. So
from your research, do you have a sense of what can help people?
I mean, I think, there are from research in terms of just behavioral stuff, as I was saying, I think having even just small amounts of social interaction we've seen can benefit against and protect against the effects of social isolation and also actually trauma. So, having that in-person real life social interaction, even if it's not, extended, even if it's not a big group, I think can be very beneficial, that we've seen that. And, hopefully moving forward, we'll be advancing how we understand the brain encodes these states and potentially coming up with molecules for therapeutic purposes. But I think real social contact would probably be my answer to that.
Well, it's kind of surprising because I think when the pandemic first hit the Earth, people were kind of like, well, this is nice. I don't have to go through rush hour, and I didn't really like smelling people at the gym and blah, blah, blah. But as it wore on, it seemed like a lot of these attitudes began to shift.
Yeah, actually, that brings me to another very interesting area of research that we're working on, and that I find super exciting, which is how can something that's actually positive in small quantities, so it's actually rewarding and positive, become so detrimental when it's prolonged, even though nothing about the stress has changed.
This is hormesis, right?
Yeah. The example I like to give is, I'm a big, rock climber and a trail runner, and I love going out and being by myself all day on the trails or, on the side of a mountain. I mean, you have a partner, but a lot of the time you're actually quite separate if you're doing something multi-pitch. And it's just so nice and extremely positive experience. And I think everyone can kind of relate to taking some mental health time for themselves, going on a walk, clearing your mind, and then you feel more ready to come back and deal with whatever life you're dealing with. But if I was left in the side of a mountain for 2 months by myself, it would be a totally different story. So this idea that something in small quantities is not only just kind of neutral, but is actually beneficial and positive, and that it becomes so detrimental when it's extended across time is super, super interesting. So we're doing some work looking at that and kind of seeing whether the rewarding qualities of isolation in short periods kind of get completely removed or deleted with extended period of time.
I like that a lot. I mean, it's almost a philosophical question at some point, right? Because it would make sense, because antibiotics are kind of similar to this as well, right? So small quantities of an antibiotic for bacteria can actually help growth. And then as you start to increase the quantities of antibiotics, then you start to see inhibition of growth. And that's because the antibiotics are signaling molecules.
Right.
And so it would make sense that there's this point where if you have signal, it's good. And then if someone's screaming, right? Like, so let's say the signal is speaking. If somebody's talking, that's great. If somebody starts screaming and then never stops, that's probably not going to be good for your mental health to listen to.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like, it's saturation of all the receptors and all of the pieces of the system that actually have to react to stuff, it seems like.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great way of putting it.
So what's next for you in the lab going forward?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like I said, we're looking at a lot of different things, some of them related to this idea of, once you've kind of developed this state of social isolation, what can you kind of do for kind of what I would consider re-entry into society, or kind of approaches to buffer against the effects of that isolation to alter behavior.
To not burn up in the stratosphere.
Yeah. We're looking at this idea of, when isolation goes from being acute and positive to prolonged and negative. And then we're looking at a lot of other different behaviors. So how does social interaction change after isolation and also after acute trauma? So the way in which you interact with other animals, whether they are, whether it's rewarding to do so, whether you prefer to interact with another member of your species or with something else. And then other kinds of behaviors. So we're looking a lot at mating behavior, which is also altered.
Yeah, we didn't even touch on that. We didn't even touch on that, but that's a super interesting topic.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. And we're looking at mating behavior and also at the vocalizations, the kind of communication that an animal will produce towards another animal, which is significantly altered after prolonged social isolation. So it's quite interesting because it's not just that the behaviors are altered, but it's also communication and vocalizations that are altered. That could be playing a big role in why the behaviors are affected. And so we're looking at that as well, and the neural circuits that underlie that. And then some prefrontal cortex stuff, kind of this idea that there's top-down inhibition that we might be able to harness in controlling the effects of isolation to alter behavior.
Like meditation?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Like meditation, or how so?
Yes, that's a great way of thinking about it. I mean, no, we're not studying meditation, but we're looking at this region of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which in humans has been linked to things like meditation, planning, decision-making, that kind of thing. So this kind of higher order structure and how much of it we can utilize to inhibit some of these negative behaviors affected by isolation.
Have you looked into the role of the adrenal system at all in any of this?
We haven't, but I do have some interesting TAC2 data looking at adrenal gland where it's also upregulated after isolation, and some other things. But yeah, I think some of the physiological effects of isolation would be really interesting to look at.
Are you familiar with the Calhoun rat experiments?
No.
So like in the 70s, I think it was James B. Calhoun. I don't remember exactly, but he
Disclaimer, everybody hates these studies.
Well, kind of. They don't necessarily hate them, but I think that they were really popular during the 70s, and then people sort of took a step back and decided that they weren't as applicable to humans as they thought. But he studied crowding, so he would build these cages for rats. He called them his rat utopias. And he would fill them with plenty of food, plenty of water, plenty of nesting sites, and then overcrowd them to an intense degree. Basically make them 10 times more crowded than the normal. Because in your papers you talk about there's a network of interactions of, 3 interactions per individual, 7 interactions per individual. He would basically take that and increase the number of interactions past the point of stability. And then he would watch as all of these creatures would just start to lose their minds, basically.
All the typical terrible things that humans do to each other.
He identified this thing that he called the behavioral sink, where there would basically be some location, usually at a feeding trough, where all of the animals would gather, and it would accelerate the process by which their behavior became dysregulated. Like he would have these interconnected rooms that he would send the mice through, and he would put the feeding trough in the central room, so everyone had to gather at the feeding trough. And as they came to the feeding trough, they had too many interactions, and they would lose their ability to perform social activities properly. Like females would lose their ability to nest, males would start to get really aggressive, they would start to mount other males, they would start to mount females without any kind of courtship rituals. And after he took the mice out of these crowded conditions and put them into less crowded conditions, the same thing continued. They never could renormalize ever again.
Oh, interesting. I mean, yeah, that's the overcrowding literature is, I think, really, really interesting. I'd love to kind of go into that direction as well.
Is there?
Yeah, I think that's worth studying for sure.
Is there a direct line between the effects that you see with isolation and the effects that you see in crowding, or are they totally different processes?
I haven't studied that at all. But yeah, I mean, I think that would definitely be an open question. It's a great question.
Good to know. We'll look into it. Well, Micky, do you have any other questions?
No, I know you're a busy scientist, and we don't want to take up too much more of your time today. But one last question I like to ask all the humans before we check out is, what is your main concern about your species going forward? Like, do you have a particular... is there something that's happening that you think humans will need to learn to address in order to make it through the next 100 years or whatever, 10 years, 5 years, 10 minutes?
Like, what's your top existential risk for humans?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my son has a book about planet Earth, and it's from planet Earth's perspective. And towards the end of the book, Earth is saying how, humans are incredible, that we're the first species that was interested in Earth, and understanding it and the processes, all these amazing things about humans, even though Earth has had, many other animals inhabit it. And then there's a page in the book that's about, the sad, unfortunately, sometimes we don't clean up after ourselves. We don't, we're not gentle. We aren't, we don't share and things like that. And then the book ends with, but I think overall humans are pretty great, and I have a good feeling that they're going to do the right thing, which I think is great. So that's a kind of weird analogy, but it is kind of to say that I, in general, have a pretty positive view. Maybe not most scientists are that way. I'm usually a pretty positive person. I think, we, in general, most humans are positive people, trying to live in this world with, families and friends and our networks and contribute something and, be part of it or, enjoy the nature and things like that. And so, I think in terms of things I'm worried about, it's like the behaviors that we do that are the farthest away from that. So, because I work on social isolation, I feel like I've really kind of had it in for like social media and things where you're just looking at a little screen the whole time. I think those are not positive. And I'm hoping we move past those. I'm not saying that, I think there's a lot of amazing things coming out of doing more computational work. And we do a lot of that as well. So I think there's lots of positive things, but I feel like that's my only concern, which is like everyone getting to a state where they're just really, it's just them and like a device that connects them to the world instead of themselves. And so that would be my one worry for mankind or humankind.
Yeah, I love your optimism. I tend to share it. I think your species has been really amazing at overcoming all of the weird barriers that have popped up so far. So I look forward to seeing what y'all make of this strange moment on Earth right now.
Yeah.
End up talking to you in the future. There's a lot of subjects that we didn't really have time to get to. So hopefully we can find the time again.
That would be great. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Where can people find you?
I have a lab website, www.zelikowskylab.com. So it's my last name. And I am on Twitter at Moriel Z, and I think Instagram too. That's just my climbing stuff.
And then you're hiring right now, right?
Yeah, we're usually hiring at most levels. So if you're interested in working on social isolation and how it's encoded in the brain, you can find our contact information on our website, and feel free to send us an email.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.